Welcome back, everybody. It's time for another deep dive. And today, Whaley, we're
Yeah.
going to be looking into a pretty dark chapter of English history, um, the witch hunts of the 17th century.
hmm
And, you know, we often think of like Salem in America when we think of witch hunts, but England had its own very intense period of witch hunting going on. And it was really tied into all of the political and religious turmoil that was happening at the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a period that continues to fascinate people
Hmm.
and horrify people for sure, even all these centuries later.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where like you can read about it in a textbook, but to really kind of understand what was going on, you have to look at, the primary sources and what was going on with the people who were actually there.
Right. Like what was the lived experience of people at the time?
Exactly. And so that's what we're going to try to do today. We're going to be diving into some of the primary source material
Yeah.
to get a better understanding of this really dark period. And one of the key figures that emerges from this period is Matthew Hopkins, the so-called Witchfinder general.
Yeah. It's interesting that the title Witchfinder General may have actually been given to him, ironically. He may not have actually claimed that title for himself.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. I always thought that was like his official title, so it's more like a nickname.
It seems like it might have been, yeah. But
Yeah.
even though it might have been ironic or maybe even like a derogatory term at the time, it definitely stuck. And it kind of speaks volumes about how he was perceived,
Mm-hmm.
both then and now.
Mm.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of, the actual witch hunting that he was doing, I think it's important to kind of set the stage a little bit. Who was this guy? Where did he come from?
Mm.
And what might have led him down this path?
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine what would possess someone to take on that kind of role.
Right.
So let's start with his background.
Yeah.
What do we know about Matthew Hopkins' early life?
Well, we know that he was the son of a Puritan clergyman. He grew up in a pretty strict and devout environment in East Anglia, which is
Here.
a region in eastern England.
Okay, so Puritan. For those of us who aren't, experts in 17th century English religious sects, what exactly does that mean? Like, what did the Puritans believe?
Right. So, the Puritans were basically a group of Protestants who wanted to kind of purify the Church of England.
Hmm.
They felt that it still had too many Catholic practices and beliefs hanging around, so they wanted to get rid of all that. And they really emphasized personal piety and a very strict moral code. Anything that they saw as frivolous or sinful was like a major no-no.
So it sounds like a pretty intense upbringing. Like every little thing you did could be seen as a sin.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And East Anglia, where Hopkins grew up, was like a real hotbed of Puritanism. And there was also this kind of underlying fear of lingering Catholic influences, which, just added another layer of anxiety and suspicion to the whole mix.
So you've got this backdrop of religious fervor, fear of the other, and then you throw in a civil war that's tearing the country apart. I mean, talk about a recipe for social and psychological upheaval.
Right. It was a really tumultuous time. And it's in this context that we find Matthew Hopkins, this young man who, for whatever reason, doesn't follow in his father's footsteps and become a clergyman. He kind of goes off on this different path, this path that leads him to become the most notorious witch finder in English history.
It really makes you wonder what was going on in his head. Was he like a true believer, convinced that he was ridding England of evil, or was there something else at play? I mean, was he maybe an opportunist, someone who saw a chance to gain power and notoriety in this chaotic world?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that historians still debate to this day. There's evidence to support both interpretations. Some people believe that he was genuinely driven by a deep-seated belief in witchcraft, maybe even scarred by something in his past, like the death of his mother when he was young. Some people think that kind of fueled a morbid fascination with the supernatural
Oh, wow.
and a desire to kind of punish anyone he saw as responsible for unleashing evil into the world.
So like a twisted sense of grief and vengeance.
Yeah, possibly. But then others argue that he was much more pragmatic, that he recognized the financial and social opportunities that witch hunting presented in a society that was already consumed by fear.
It's almost like he was a dark entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
Tapping into this pre-existing market of anxiety and offering a service that people, sadly, were all too eager to pay for.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that he wasn't operating alone. He had a partner in crime, a guy named John Stern.
Right, John Stern. Tell me about him. What was his role in all of this?
Well, he was a bit older than Hopkins, and unlike Hopkins, he had a family. And interestingly, it seems that he might have been the one who actually initiated contact with the local magistrates,
Yeah.
basically like drumming up business for their witch hunting enterprise.
So they weren't just like rogue agents operating in the shadows. They were actually working with or at least alongside the authorities.
It seems that way, yeah.
That's pretty chilling.
It is. It really speaks to the level of acceptance, or at least tolerance, that witch hunting had in certain segments of English society at that time. I mean, this wasn't just like a fringe belief. It was pretty deeply embedded in the culture,
Yeah.
and in some cases even reinforced by those in positions of power.
So how did Hopkins and Stern actually go about finding these supposed witches?
From what I've read, their methods were, to put it mildly, questionable.
Yeah, you could say that their methods were often really brutal
Hmm.
and relied on techniques that we would definitely consider to be torture and psychological manipulation today.
When this was all without any kind of official authority from Parliament, right?
Yeah.
They were operating based on requests from local communities and magistrates.
Exactly, yeah. And often kind of pushing the boundaries of what was legally acceptable.
Wow. So what were some of the specific methods they used?
Well, one of their most infamous tactics was sleep deprivation. They would keep suspects awake for days on end, just to kind of break down their resistance and make them more susceptible to suggestion. I can't even imagine the toll that would take on someone. Just the sheer exhaustion alone would probably drive you to say or do anything just to make it stop.
Oh, absolutely. And that wasn't all. They also employed women to conduct these very invasive physical examinations of the accused. They were searching for what they called the devil's mark.
With the devil's mark, what was that?
Basically, they believed that the devil would leave a physical mark on anyone who made a pact with him. This could be like an extra nipple, a birthmark, even just a mole or a blemish.
So basically any physical imperfection could be used as evidence of witchcraft.
Pretty much, yeah. It was a completely arbitrary and subjective standard,
Mm-hmm.
and ripe for abuse and misinterpretation.
And then there were the interrogations themselves, right? Those were also pretty manipulative.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They used all sorts of leading questions and threats and promises to try to coerce confessions out of people. They would twist words, misrepresent what people said, and really create this atmosphere of fear and intimidation, designed to basically extract the truth that they wanted to hear.
It's just horrifying to think about what those poor people went through. Innocent until proven guilty was clearly not a concept that Hopkins and Stern subscribed to.
No, not at all. And what's even more disturbing is that their very first victim was a woman named Elizabeth Clark. She was a middle-aged woman with a disability, and she was accused of cursing a local carter.
A disabled woman.
Eh.
Seriously. I mean, talk about a vulnerable target.
It's awful. And sadly, she was just the first of many victims, as this witch hunt began to spread like wildfire across Essex and Suffolk and beyond.
It's important to remember that this wasn't just some abstract historical event. This was real people's lives being destroyed based on nothing more than fear and superstition and the ambitions of these two men who were exploiting this climate of terror for their own gain.
It's a sobering thought for sure, and it's something that we'll explore in more detail. As we continue our deep dive, as we kind of delve deeper into this, it's important to remember that Hopkins and Stern, they weren't just randomly targeting people. Their accusations often followed certain patterns, which really reveals how much kind of societal anxieties and fear played into this whole witch hunt frenzy.
So you're saying like there were certain types of people who were more likely to be accused?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, like for example, women, especially older women, they were disproportionately targeted, those who were maybe more isolated or marginalized within their communities. They were often the ones who were kind of singled out.
It's a pattern that we see throughout history, isn't it? When societies are facing like upheaval or uncertainty, it's often the most vulnerable who become scapegoats for the collective fear and anger.
Yeah, it's really sad, but it's true. And in 17th century England, a lot of those fears and anxieties just manifested in these accusations of witchcraft. Like, imagine if your crops failed, or your livestock died, or a loved one fell ill. It was easy to kind of blame those misfortunes on, some malevolent influence of a witch lurking in the shadows.
Right. It's like that classic need to find someone to blame, someone to make sense of the chaos and the suffering.
Exactly. And Hopkins and Stern were more than happy to provide that scapegoat. For a price, of course.
Right. Speaking of price, didn't these witch hunts also have like a significant financial impact on the communities that they were basically ravaging?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, remember these communities, they were already struggling with the economic fallout from the Civil War, and they were actually paying Hopkins and Stern for their services.
So not only were they being terrorized by these witch hunts, but they were also being financially drained by them.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic when you think about it.
It really is. Like they were spending precious resources trying to eradicate witches, hoping for a better future. but often they just ended up more divided and impoverished in the process.
Exact. It's a vicious cycle.
It makes you wonder, did no one question what Hopkins and Stern were doing? Was there no skepticism or pushback against their methods?
There was actually There were some voices of reason and dissent, even in this climate of fear. Some people, especially those who witnessed firsthand the brutality of what Hopkins and Stern were doing, they began to doubt the legitimacy of their claims and the confessions they were getting.
So it wasn't just like mass hysteria with everyone blindly following along.
No, not really. I mean, while fear and superstition certainly played a part, it's important to remember that people in the 17th century, they weren't stupid. They weren't gullible. A lot of them were intelligent and observant, and they started to notice the inconsistencies and the contradictions and just the sheer cruelty of what was happening.
Do we have any examples of people who actually spoke out against the witch hunts?
Yeah, definitely. One notable example is a guy named John Gall. He was a minister in Huntingdonshire, and he publicly challenged Hopkins and Stern. He even published sermons where he denounced their methods as unchristian and unjust.
Wow, that took some guts.
Yeah.
Imagine speaking out against that kind of prevailing narrative, especially when it's fueled by fear and religious zealotry.
Yeah, he was definitely a brave man, and his voice was one of many. That eventually contributed to this growing opposition that ultimately helped to bring about the decline of the witch hunts.
Okay, so speaking of that decline, what were some of the other factors that led to the eventual downfall of Hopkins and Stern?
Well, as we've talked about, their methods were increasingly being challenged. People started to question the whole idea of the devil's mark and the reliability of these coerced confessions and just the lack of due process that was afforded to the accused.
And remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the English Civil War.
Yeah.
The country is in turmoil, divided along political and religious lines.
Exactly. And the witch hunts kind of became another battleground in this broader conflict. The Royalists who were opposed to the Puritans, they were quick to point out the irony of this godly Puritan heartland being supposedly overrun with witches. They used it as propaganda to kind of highlight the hypocrisy and fanaticism of their opponents.
So the witch hunts became like a political football.
In a way, yeah. But the Puritans, of course, had their own counter-narrative. They argued that East Anglia, being a stronghold of true piety, was precisely why the devil would target it with such ferocity.
It's almost like they were saying, we're so righteous, the devil is jealous.
Right. It's a fascinating example of how both sides used the witch hunts to kind of bolster their own agendas and demonize their opponents.
And we can't forget that this was also a period of immense intellectual and scientific ferment. New ideas were emerging. Traditional beliefs were being challenged.
Right. There was this growing sense that the world was more complex and nuanced than people had previously thought.
Exactly. And that rise of skepticism and rational inquiry really played a crucial role in undermining the credibility of the witch hunts.
Yeah, as people began to demand evidence and apply critical thinking to these accusations, the whole flimsy foundation of Hopkins and Stern's enterprise just started to crumble.
It's a reminder that progress and enlightenment, they're not these linear processes.
Right.
They often involve setbacks and periods of darkness. But ultimately, the human desire for knowledge and understanding tends to prevail.
I agree. And in the case of the English witch hunts, that shift towards a more reasoned and evidence-based approach eventually led to a decline in the accusations and executions.
Which brings us, thankfully, to the end of Hopkins and Stern's reign of terror.
Yeah.
So what ultimately happened to them?
Well, Hopkins died in 1647 under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Some people think that he might have succumbed to one of the very diseases that had fueled the fear of witchcraft in the first place.
Kind of a poetic justice?
Maybe, yeah. And as for Stern, he kind of just fades from the historical record. We don't know for sure what happened to him, but it's safe to say that his reputation was pretty tarnished by his association with Hopkins and the whole witch hunt debacle.
But even though their reign of terror ended, their legacy lived on, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hopkins and Stern became cautionary tales, symbols of the dangers of unchecked power and fear-mongering, and the abuse of legal processes.
Yeah, their story is a stark reminder of how easily fear and suspicion can be manipulated to create scapegoats and justify injustice. And that's a lesson that resonates deeply even today.
It does. We may not have Witchfinders roaming the countryside anymore, but the same dynamics are still at play. The same dynamics of fear and scapegoating and the erosion of due process. They can still manifest in different ways, Think about how quickly misinformation can spread these days, how easily public opinion can be swayed, and how readily we sometimes embrace simplistic explanations for complex problems.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. But it's also a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, of demanding evidence, and speaking out against injustice wherever we see it.
You know, we talked a lot about the victims of the witch hunts, and rightfully so, but I'm also curious about the perpetrators, the accusers. What motivated them to point the finger at their neighbors, often with devastating consequences?
Yeah, that's a really complex question, and it's one that historians are still trying to understand. In some cases, it might have been genuine belief, like a real conviction that the accused person possessed evil powers and was harming the community.
So like a kind of misplaced righteousness.
Possibly,
Yeah.
yeah. But in other cases, the motivations might have been more personal. Things like envy or greed or revenge, or even just a desire to deflect suspicion from themselves.
It's like the Salem witch trials all over again, where personal grudges and power struggles often played a role in the accusations.
Exactly. And we can't discount the role of social pressure and conformity either. In a climate of fear and suspicion, it could be really dangerous to speak out against the prevailing narrative, even if you had doubts. It was often easier and maybe even safer to just go along with the crowd.
So it's this complex mix of fear and belief and opportunism and social pressure
Yeah.
that fueled these witch hunts.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's a reminder that even in seemingly rational societies, human behavior can be driven by really powerful and often irrational forces.
You know, you mentioned earlier that Hopkins and Stern often employed women to search for the devil's mark. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What was the role of women in these witch hunts?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's an often overlooked aspect of this whole story. Women played a variety of roles in the witch hunts, both as accusers and as the accused. As we've discussed, they were often the ones being targeted as witches, seen as more susceptible to the devil's influence
Yeah.
because of their supposed weakness or inherent evil.
But they were also involved in the persecution itself.
Yeah, and that makes their role even more complex and tragic in some ways. Some women, perhaps motivated by fear or a desire for social standing, actually actively participated in the witch hunts, serving as searchers or interrogators or even witnesses against the accused.
It's almost like oppression can take many forms.
Yeah.
And sometimes the oppressed become complicit in their own subjugation.
Exactly. And in the case of the witch hunts, that complicity often stemmed from a very deep-seated belief in the reality of witchcraft, a belief that was reinforced by the culture, by the church, and even by other women.
So it wasn't just a simple case of men persecuting women.
No, it was much more nuanced than that, and much more unsettling in some ways. It was women sometimes participating in the persecution of other women.
Wow. It's hard to wrap your head around that.
It is, and it's something that historians are still trying to fully understand. Like, what were the motivations of these women? Were they true believers? Were they seeking power or revenge? Or were they just trying to survive in a dangerous and uncertain world?
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray, complex motivations, and often tragic consequences.
Exactly. And speaking of shades of gray, there's another aspect of this story that I think we need to address. The question of the confessions themselves.
You mean the confessions that Hopkins and Stern were extracting from the accused?
Yeah, we've talked about how those confessions were often coerced through sleep deprivation and torture and psychological manipulation. But there's another layer to this that we haven't really explored yet, the content of the confessions themselves.
What do you mean?
Well, if you actually read these confessions, they often follow a very specific narrative. The accused typically describes encounters with demonic figures, pacts with the devil, the ability to fly, the power to harm others through curses or spells.
So they're basically conforming to the stereotype of a witch, as it was defined by the beliefs of that time.
Exactly. And that raises a really interesting question. Were these confessions simply a product of coercion and manipulation, or did they actually reflect a genuine belief in witchcraft on the part of the accused?
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, on the one hand, it's clear that these confessions were obtained under duress, so it's hard to know how much truth there really is to them.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if people genuinely believed in witchcraft, then maybe some of them did believe that they had these powers, or that they had interacted with demonic forces.
Right. It's a really complex issue, and it gets to the heart of how belief and fear and social pressure can shape our perceptions and even our memories.
It makes you wonder how much of what we believe is actually based on evidence, and how much is shaped by the narratives that we're exposed to, the stories we tell ourselves, and the pressures we face to conform.
Yeah, for sure. It's a question that's relevant not just to 17th century witch hunts, but to our own lives today and the ways in which we make sense of the world around us.
So how do we reconcile the fact that some of these confessions might have been genuine expressions of belief with the undeniable reality that these individuals were subjected to horrific abuse and injustice.
That's the challenge, isn't it? To acknowledge the complexity of human experience, the interplay of belief and fear and social pressure, without minimizing the very real harm that was inflicted upon these individuals.
It's a reminder that history is not just about facts and dates. It's about understanding the human condition, the choices that we make and the consequences that ripple outward, both for ourselves and for others.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, glimmers of hope and resistance can emerge. As we discussed earlier, the English witch hunts didn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, reason and skepticism and a growing sense of compassion prevailed.
Which brings us to the legacy of the witch hunts, a topic that we'll explore in more detail in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've really gone through a pretty dark period of English history here, uncovering the, chilling details of the witch hunts and the methods that Hopkins and Stern used, and all of the kind of complex social and political factors that were fueling this whole thing. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's important to kind of shift our focus now to the legacy of the witch hunts. What lessons can we actually learn from this period of history? And how do those lessons kind of resonate with us today?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question. I mean, how do we make sense of the past? Not just as a collection of facts and dates and names, but as a way to understand, our own human tendencies, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion.
Exactly, because while these witch hunts might seem like a distant and thankfully bygone era, the forces that drove them, the fear, the suspicion, the desire for scapegoats, the abuse of power, those things are still very much present in our world today.
It's true. It's unsettling, but it's true.
Yeah.
We may not have witchfinders roaming the countryside anymore, but we still have people who try to exploit our anxieties.
Yeah.
Who, peddle misinformation, who demonize anyone they see as the other, and who erode the principles of justice and due process for their own gain.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important takeaways from the English witch hunts is the danger of unchecked power, especially when that power is combined with fear and a lack of accountability.
Yeah, we saw how Hopkins and Stern, operating with very little oversight or legal authority, were able to just wreak havoc on entire communities, terrorizing individuals, manipulating the justice system to serve their own ends.
And it reminds us that power, whether it's political or social or even just interpersonal, can be abused so easily, especially when those in power believe that they're acting with righteous intent.
It's that the ends justify the means mentality.
Exactly, which can be incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's something we need to be vigilant about, both in our own lives and in the larger society. We need to hold those in power accountable. We need to demand transparency. And we need to make sure that the principles of justice and fairness are upheld, even when things are chaotic and fear and uncertainty are running high.
But it's not just about those in positions of authority, right?
Yeah.
The witch hunts also show us the power of groupthink, how easily we can get swayed by the prevailing narrative, especially when that narrative is fueled by fear and reinforced by everyone around us.
Right. We saw how entire communities could get caught up in this frenzy of accusations and trials and turn against their neighbors, often based on flimsy evidence or just because it was easier to conform than to dissent.
It's a chilling reminder of how susceptible we are to mob mentality and how quickly reason and compassion can just vanish when fear takes over.
Yeah. And it's something we all need to be aware of in our own lives. We need to be willing to question assumptions, to challenge the prevailing narrative, and to stand up for what we believe is right, even when it's hard or unpopular.
Because silence is complicity, right?
Exactly.
And I think another really crucial lesson from the witch hunts is the importance of critical thinking, of demanding evidence, and of not accepting things at face value, just because they fit into our preconceived notions or confirm our biases.
Yeah. I mean, look at how Hopkins and Stern exploited the prevailing beliefs about witchcraft. They used these pseudoscientific methods like searching for the devil's mark to legitimize their accusations and manipulate the evidence to fit their narrative.
It shows how important it is to be discerning consumers of information, to evaluate claims critically and to be wary of those who prey on our fears or appeal to our emotions without actually providing solid evidence.
Especially in today's world, with social media and this constant barrage of information coming at us from all sides.
Yeah, it can be so hard to separate fact from fiction, truth from propaganda.
It really can. But that's why it's more crucial than ever to develop those critical thinking skills, to learn how to ask the right questions, and to demand evidence before accepting something is true.
So the legacy of the witch hunts is a complex one. It's a story of fear and persecution and injustice. But it's also a story of resilience and resistance, and the enduring power of reason and compassion.
It's a story that continues to resonate with us today, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of critical thinking, and the need to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
And maybe most importantly, it reminds us of the fragility of our own beliefs and how easily we can be swayed by fear and prejudice, and this desire for simple answers to really complex problems.
It's a call to action, a challenge to be more mindful, more compassionate, and more vigilant in our own lives and in the world around us.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the chilling world of 17th century English witch hunts.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have found it both informative and thought-provoking.
I hope so too.
All right.
And for those of you who want to explore this topic further, we'll be providing a list of resources and further reading in the show notes.
And as always, we encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts. Challenge us with your own questions and insights.
Because history isn't just something we learn about, it's something we engage with, something we debate, and something we use to inform our present and shape our future.
Exactly. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.